don't see any small children. It does say a message for all ages. And I wanted to share with you today, we're going to have a story about the beginning of the church. The spreading of the good news of God's love and grace through leaders as the church grew. And that's kind of what we're doing until Pentecost. And that includes Timothy. Now, we aren't talking about Timothy this morning, but Timothy learned about God's love from his mother and his grandmother, Eunice. And today is Mother's Day, so we want to thank all the women of the church, as Jen did as well too, for being, for nurturing the leaders of the church, for helping all of us to grow in our faith, whether biological or not. All help us to grow into disciples. And so we are giving out flowers today. And since there are no children to do it, my husband and I will be doing it. Okay, go. I took out the packet. Thank you.
I think peace is so hard to find these days, so I'm so honored to be able to light the peace candle today. And I have a little peace prayer that I keep right next to my front door and think about it when I walk out. Go forth into the world in peace. Be of good courage. Hold fast to that which is good. Render no one evil for evil. Help the afflicted, support the weak, honor all people, serve the Lord, and the peace of God will guard your minds and your hearts forever. Amen.
Amen. Our scripture reading today is Acts 13, 1 through 3, 14, 8 through 18. The church at Antioch included prophets and teachers: Barnabas, Simeon, nicknamed Niger, Lucius from Cyrene, Manaen, a childhood friend of Herod the ruler, and Saul. As they were worshiping the Lord and fasting, the Holy Spirit said, "Appoint Barnabas and Saul to the work I have called them to undertake." After they fasted and prayed, they laid their hands on these two and sent them off. In Lystra, there was a certain man who lacked strength in his legs. He had been crippled since birth and had never walked. Sitting there, he heard Paul speaking. Paul stared at him and saw that he believed he could be healed. Raising his voice, Paul said, "Stand up straight on your feet." He jumped up and began to walk. Seeing what Paul had done, the crowd shouted in the Lycaonian language, "The gods have taken human form and come down to visit us." They referred to Barnabas as Zeus and to Paul as Hermes, since Paul was the main speaker. The priest of Zeus, whose temple was located just outside the city, brought bulls and wreaths to the city gates. Along with the crowds, he wanted to offer sacrifices to them. When the Lord's messengers, Barnabas and Paul, found out about this, they tore their clothes in protest and rushed out into the crowd. They shouted, "People, what are you doing? We are humans too, just like you. We are proclaiming the good news to you. Turn to the living God and away from such worthless things. He made the heaven, the earth, the sea, and everything in them. In the past, he permitted every nation to go its own way. Nevertheless, he hasn't left himself without a witness. He has blessed you by giving you rain from above as well as seasonal harvests, and satisfying you with food and happiness." Even with these words, they barely kept the crowds from sacrificing to them.
Each year, on the second Sunday of May, we celebrate mothers. Usually with some flowers, candy, greeting cards. We show them that we care. And to be honest, no one would hate that more than the woman who created Mother's Day, Anna Jarvis. She was born in West Virginia, and her mom was a Sunday school teacher, and she created clubs for that taught women how to care for their children. Her mother had prayed at one of these clubs or meetings that were gathering. She was also very much an activist, that there would one day be a day to commemorating mothers for their service to humanity. The second Sunday of May was chosen because Anna had made a vow at her mother's grave that she would try to fulfill her mother's prayer and wish, and that was the Sunday that was closest to her mother's death. She created Mother's Day, and it actually went on for a long time before it became official in 1908 as a national holiday. But it was not the holiday that she had in mind. She hated that it became commercialized, I guess, immediately. She railed against greeting card companies, florists, and candy companies for making a profit on this day that she had created for so many other reasons. And she spent her life working against what Mother's Day had become, about flowers and candy. Anna Jarvis struggled with what she meant for good, going a whole other direction, and she could not get people to hear her. In our Bible story this morning, Saul and Barnabas experienced something very similar. What they mean to convey is for good, but it goes awry. Paul and Barnabas were sharing the gospel, the good news, to a culture that was pretty similar to ours. Paul appeals to what the people thought they knew about God in order to move them to embrace what they didn't know about God. So what do we know about God? And what do those who never darken the door of any church or, other religious place know about God? Some of our knowledge about God comes from some of these familiar myths. God helps those who help themselves. The pain we experience is part of God's plan. Everything happens for a reason, and only God knows. God teaches us lessons by testing our faith. And my least favorite, God doesn't give us any more than we can handle. The problem is that despite all the preaching and teaching we may experience throughout our lives, despite any study of the Bible we may do about the nature and character of God, these myths are deeply embedded in our society, and our culture totally reinforces them. The truth is that the gospel counters all these myths. God does not bring about testing and suffering, but God is present with us in our challenges and struggles always. In our passage today, we hear of Paul healing a man. The Lycaonians are trying to make sense of what God is doing through Paul. The people have their own frames of reference. They know about Greek gods and goddesses. Paul performs this healing, and suddenly he is Hermes and Barnabas is Zeus. Paul and Barnabas attempt to make the message familiar to them. This misunderstanding is not really so strange. We may look at it and think it's so, but they were familiar with Greek gods and goddesses, and that was their framework. Paul and Barnabas needed to and were trying to reframe it, calling out, don't deify us, ripping off their clothes to show their bodies were human just like the rest of them. They're trying to reaffirm their shared humanity. See, for many of the ancient world, a God coming to earth was not something they anticipated, but rather something they feared. Gods in Greek and other ancient mythologies often wreaked havoc on those that they visited. Now, some of this knowledge or myths about God that are around, those have also wreaked havoc on people today in society as well. There's no comfort in being told any of these myths when you are suffering a loss. When I was a young mother, I had my 2 older boys. I had 2 miscarriages in, just less than a year. And I was at a Bible study, and I thought I was in a safe place that I could share how I was feeling. And right away somebody came in with, there were a lot of other people who were suffering worse than me, and that I should be grateful for what I had, that I had 2 boys. And that was no comfort at the time when I was feeling pain, and to be honest, I got up and I walked out of the room and went to find some place where somebody would listen to me and comfort me. What kind of a gospel message are we sharing with folks? I hope it's the kind that causes them to feel loved by God rather than in fear of how God might test them. We all need a little shaking up about this whole subject now and again, and through the ages we have allowed certain things to co-opt the gospel. Manifest destiny. I mean, we had a whole, theology and mind frame in this country that God had ordained that the peoples of the United States should take over this whole land. Whether it be from, people who were already there, or people who had settled there, or people who were in conflict with us, God had ordained it, and it was ours for the taking, to rule this land. And then throughout the Old Testament and the New Testament, we identify sometimes, or people have identified the servants of God with God. They've made a mistake and wanted to worship the one who was doing it. The story tells us that Barnabas and Paul can barely restrain them from offering sacrifices to them. Last week, we heard the story of Cornelius, who, when Peter came to him, he fell at his feet to worship him. But Peter right away told him, no, I'm just a man like you. And Cornelius got it right away. Not so much with the folks in Lystra. I think one of the major mistakes that Paul makes is that he negates the beliefs of the people in Lystra. He tells them that their religious practices are worthless. And if we continued reading to verse 19 and 20, we would find out that, I don't know why they ended the story then, and I should have added it, that they dragged Paul out to the gates and stoned him, leaving him for dead. But Paul survives, and he and Barnabas move on to another place to continue their missionary journeys. Belittling or negating the beliefs of others is not helpful, or, I believe, true to the gospel, especially today. We live in a country and a world that is full of religious diversity. All religions have much more in common than they have differences. And I believe God is bigger than we can imagine. In this climate of religious intolerance where some folks are deemed unwelcome because of their belief system, we need to honor and support other religions, our neighbors. No religious practice is worthless. Just as no person, no culture, no gender, no sexual identity, no body, no religion is worthless. There is the breath of God in the majority, if not all, expressions of faith. Paul has told the people of Lystra that they know our God, that our God created heaven and earth, that they know the God who has fed them and watered their fields, the God who created them all. Paul is trying to reshape their worldview. Just like the Laconians, we can misperceive. Think of all the time the apostles didn't get it right. They didn't understand. How many times did they misunderstand Jesus when they were in his presence? But God meets us where we are and takes us to where we need to be. I love that the passage refers to creation as pointing to God. I have a green Bible which has all the passages which are about creation and ecology and whatever, and that's a green portion in that Bible. And then, of course, Paul and Barnabas point to God, despite the fact that they're being mistaken for Hermes and Zeus. Despite the misstep of insulting the beliefs of the people in Lystra, Paul and Barnabas meant to share the good news, to do good for them. But they couldn't control the response of the people. I hope most of you know that Mother's Day had its roots in justice. Anna's mother, Anne, it's confusing, in the mid-1800s had held Mother's Day work clubs to improve sanitary conditions to try to lower infant mortality. These women had worked hard to limit the spread of disease and contamination in milk. The mothers' groups had also tended to wounded soldiers during the U.S. Civil War on both sides. After the Civil War, Anna's mother and other women organized Mother's Fellowship Day picnics and other events as pacifist strategies to unite former foes. They were trying to bring people back together again. Julia Ward Howe was a part of this, best known for being the composer of the Battle Hymn of the Republic, and she issued a widely read Mother's Day proclamation calling women to take an active political role in promoting peace. Around the same time, Ann Jarvis had initiated a Mother's Day Fellowship Day for Union and Confederate Loyalists to come together across West Virginia. But it was her daughter, Anna, who was responsible for creating Mother's Day and who would spend most of her later life fighting the limitation and sentimentality of what it had become. She spent her life's work and fortune wanting the good message of Mother's Day to prevail because she was for peace and justice and honoring the work that women and mothers have done promoting that. Perhaps if she continued to promote that and not so much railed against the other things, today and going forward on Mother's Day, let us honor all women who work for peace and justice. Paul and Barnabas wanted to share good news. It was misunderstood, but I have to believe that there were some in Lystra who believed, who got the message right. What we mean for good sometimes goes astray. It doesn't go in the direction we hope. But let us always do our best and accept that we are not always in control of how others perceive our best efforts. Amen.